There is a monument in Dublin to Charles Stewart Parnell, who was a 19th century Irish politician who memorably said, "No man has the right to say to his country, 'Thus far shalt thou go, and no further.'" Now, Parnell was talking in 1885 about British rule in Ireland. But after independence, a different set of boundaries arose. The 1937 Constitution was in effect Ireland's religious Berlin Wall, with its declaration that all authority comes from the Most Holy Trinity, and its reference to us humbly acknowledging our obligations to our divine Lord Jesus Christ. Yesterday's historic vote for marriage equality has started the fall of Ireland's religious Berlin Wall. Finally, love and hope have burst through the boundaries of fear and control that were put in stone 80 years ago in Ireland. As the first country in the world to endorse marriage equality for gay people by popular vote of the people, Ireland can never again be seen as a repressive Catholic state. I'm looking forward to flying back home tomorrow to a better Ireland, a more compassionate Ireland and a more equal Ireland than the island that I flew out from on Friday to come to here after voting. But the marriage equality vote wasn't the only significant event in Ireland last week. In 1979, in a seaside village in County Sligo in Ireland, the IRA blew up a fishing boat and murdered the elderly English Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was the great-uncle of Prince Charles of England, along with Baroness Doreen Brabourne and two children aged 14 and 15. It was one of the more significant murders of the IRA campaign in Ireland. This week, a few short decades later, Prince Charles of England visited Ireland, visited the site of that atrocity, and later on his visit to Ireland he shook hands with Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, two of the leaders of the IRA who had murdered his great-uncle back in Sligo. And like the marriage equality vote, those handshakes would have been considered unthinkable just a short period ago. Like the marriage equality referendum, it was a referendum in 1998 that formalised a change in Irish thinking that had been bubbling under the surface for years, when overwhelmingly 94% of the Irish people endorsed in referendum the Belfast Agreement that ended the euphemistically described troubles in Northern Ireland. The marriage equality referendum, as I mentioned yesterday when I was talking about the result, also in a way had its roots in violence. In 1982, in a quiet park in Dublin, a gay man called Declan Flynn was beaten to death by a gang of self-declared queer bashers, and when they were taken to court, the judge found them, they were found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder. The judge made reference to them trying to clean up the area. Back in those days, homosexual acts were actually illegal in Ireland. And they were given a suspended sentence, and they had a victory march back to Fairview Park. That resulted in a large protest march organised by the gay community in Ireland, and that gradually evolved into what is today's annual Pride Parade in Dublin, a celebration of the gay community in Ireland and of their relationship with the straight community in Ireland, and ultimately led to the referendum that has changed Ireland so historically. I still don't really fully appreciate until I go back home the importance of that. But I would like to ask, what I'm hoping to address today in a way that will also be relevant to other countries, is what has caused those momentous changes in Ireland, from an Ireland of terrorism and religious bigotry to an Ireland where, despite those problems not yet being resolved, we can at least look forward to the future with optimism. And much of it has been just the inevitable tide of history that in the developing world, democracy is causing countries to become more peaceful and secular through things like education, pluralism, communications technology. It's happening all around the world. If you look at the World Values Survey, you'll find evidence that that is a trend everywhere. But part of it has also been the organised campaigns by so many people on both sides of the border against terrorism and religious bigotry, and for democratic secular values. So today what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to share the 5 most important lessons that I have learned from my involvement in those campaigns over the decades, from chairing the Peace and Democracy Group New Consensus back in the 1980s and 1990s to chairing the Atheist and Secular Advocacy Group Atheist Ireland in more recent years. Now, as an overview, I'm going to suggest that building just and peaceful and secular communities involves us treating ideas and behaviour differently than we treat people. We should robustly challenge harmful ideas and behaviour, but we should respect the people who hold those beliefs that we find harmful as people. More specifically, with regard to the theme of this conference, which is Give Peace a Chance in the context of secularism and conflict, I'm going to examine the following 5 steps for peaceful secularism. The first is stand up to violence. The second is seek respectful dialogue. The third is start with human rights. The fourth is be proactive in politics. And the fifth is to establish secular schools. Now, all of those 5 steps have been common to both of the major campaigns that we have been involved in Ireland. First of all, for peace and democracy and against terrorism, and more recently for secularism. And I hope that those lessons will be broad enough to be transferable to different situations in different countries, although I'll be articulating them in the context of Ireland. The first is stand up to violence. And there's of course a paradox there, because sometimes in order to stand up to violence, you have to use violence to stand up to violence. There was a saying in the American Wild West that the final rule of poker is that a Smith & Wesson revolver beats 4 aces. And that's something that the terrorists are aware of, and it's something that we have to be aware of in order countering it. And so as individuals, we need the right to defend ourselves if we're physically attacked. And as a society, we need a police force and we need armies to defend our democratic values when they are attacked. When police forces and armies engage in unjust violence, which they sometimes do, they need to be reformed. But when undemocratic groups engage in violence, they need to be disbanded. And that applies to everybody from criminal gangs to terrorist organisations like ISIS to undemocratic states that infringe on the human rights of their own citizens. But the question that I would like to ask is what we can do as citizens without the power of the state to enforce our decisions. Well, when the IRA were murdering people, we did a number of things in Ireland. The IRA were supposedly acting in the name of the people of Ireland, so when they held their conferences in Dublin and the international media came over, we held protests outside to let the international media know that these people were not acting in our name. Those protests started with just 5 people outside one of the early Sinn Féin conferences, and gradually grew until there were hundreds of people taking part, and culminated in a rally of over 30,000 people in Dublin after a particularly horrific IRA atrocity. When someone in the IRA had the bright idea of trying to unite Ireland by bombing the rail line between Dublin and Belfast, which was one of the few links between the 2 parts of the island, we organised a series of peace trains where we allowed people from both sides of the border to travel across in solidarity and to meet with each other in just ordinary circumstances. After one particularly bad IRA atrocity, a number of us chained ourselves to the gates of the Sinn Féin offices in Dublin and wouldn't let them in, and highlighted that if they were going to be acting in our name, that we would stand up to them. We collected thousands of flowers and condolence cards from people in the Republic of Ireland and brought them to the sites of atrocities, both by the IRA and by the loyalist paramilitaries in Northern Ireland. And we also protested when agents of the Irish or British states acted outside the law and unjustly killed people. Now, it wasn't always easy. We faced the usual threats that you would expect in a situation like that, and sometimes worse than threats. But as we continued, more and more people got involved, and we found that what we had initially mistakenly thought was public apathy about the killings in Northern Ireland was actually a sense of helplessness, a feeling that the people couldn't do anything, and that when they were given a vehicle to express their opinions, people responded, and as more people got involved, more and more people got involved. I'll tell you a brief story about David Norris, who I might have mentioned yesterday as the first openly gay Irish parliamentarian. He was also involved in the campaign against the IRA, and in his inimitable style, when he received a death threat once from the IRA, allegedly, he brought it to the police and he asked what he should do, and the police said, well, you know, you should vary your route to work perhaps, just to be on the safe side. And he said, well look, I live in North Great George's Street, I work in Trinity College, if any of you are familiar with Dublin. I can change my route to work by going over one or other of 2 bridges. He said, I think they'll probably figure that out. So he said, I'll deal with it myself. And he went down to the Sinn Féin offices and he asked to speak to someone in authority. And they brought down a guy called Joe Cahill, who has since died, but who was one of the most senior IRA men of his day. And David said, Mr. Cahill, I have here what purports to be a death threat from a representative of your organisation, and I hope you can deal with it for me. But first of all, if you're sending me these things, could you please send them to my home address rather than to my office, because it upsets my secretary? And secondly, if you're planning to assassinate me, I live just around the corner in North Great George's Street, and it might be cheaper than a stamp if you just call around and say about it at home. And he left it at that. And a few months later, about a year later, we were having a protest outside the Sinn Féin offices after one atrocity. And we were symbolically giving letters to the Sinn Féin asking them to stop supporting IRA murders. And David and I were handing in the letter with a number of media present. And who comes to answer the door to collect the letter other than Joe Cahill? And they started to introduce Joe Cahill to us. And David said, ah yes, Mr. Cahill, you may remember we met before when I brought a death threat that your organisation had sent me and I asked you to deal with it. Now I haven't heard since from either you or the gentleman who sent it, so I'm assuming you dealt with it. Thank you very much. Now, this brings me in sense to my second point, and David was being a bit facetious about it, but the second point, as a serious point, is the need to seek respectful dialogue. Because our message as peace campaigners transcended party politics. We built a single issue campaign that was supported by Irish and British, by left and right, by green and orange, by businesses and trade unionists. And our message was simple, like, whatever your aim, just pursue it peacefully and democratically. And we didn't promote any particular political outcome, whether it be United Ireland or a maintenance of the union with Britain, but we promoted the principles upon which a democratic solution should be based, which included an end to terrorism and promoting principles like mutual respect and civil liberty and freely giving it allegiance to whatever institutions of state may exist. And those values were eventually reflected in the Belfast Agreement of 1998, which was overwhelmingly endorsed by referendum on both sides of the Irish border. And that agreement came about not by violence, although standing up to the violence was an important part of it, but it came about by complicated, patient work in bringing about respectful dialogue. Respecting the right of people to hold views and aspirations that other people found repugnant, as long as they were promoted peacefully and democratically. And even starting that dialogue was difficult, because a lot of people on a lot of sides confuse dialogue with surrender. And it's a difficult thing to get a start on. But it's not the case, because firstly you can talk to people without negotiating with them, and secondly you can negotiate with people without surrendering to them. And the formula that was used in the Belfast Agreement was starting off with what were described as talks about talks, where the ground rules will be established for dialogue. Ground rules such as nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, which gives people the space to agree things that without feeling that they were giving away too much without getting anything back. And similarly with Atheist Ireland, we believe strongly in respectful dialogue. We'll robustly criticise ideas and behaviour, and we're quite prepared to offend people, including through blasphemy, through opposing the blasphemy laws. All ideas and behaviour should be open to robust challenge, including ridicule, if people want to ridicule religious or other ideas. Our position is that you have rights, but your beliefs don't. But we combine that with constructive dialogue with individual Christian and Muslim activists and groups, many of whom we recognise believe just as strongly as we do that what they're doing is morally right. Because if you believe that something is sanctioned or indeed mandated by the creator of the universe, that's a pretty strong motivating factor for engaging in it. And you need to have some amount of subtlety if you actually want to move beyond that instead of just criticising it. One of our more surprising allies in Ireland is in some of our campaigns is the Evangelical Alliance of Ireland. Because, like atheists, they're discriminated against in what is still a mostly Catholic Ireland at institutional level. They recently published a book about the referendum, which they opposed, and I contributed content to that book. We also had a debate that we hosted ourselves about the same-sex marriage referendum, at which we invited speakers from both sides and gave equal time to both sides with a neutral chairperson in order to encourage constructive dialogue. The other thing that I think is very important in today is the internet. The internet has changed how we communicate. Not necessarily for younger people, but for those of us of a pre-internet age, it has revolutionised the way that we communicate. And many of those changes are helpful. You know, we can form new communities of shared interest. We can energise campaigns. And we can subvert attempts to silence dissent. But some of the changes are not helpful. In particular, people writing on the internet can become desensitised to the fact that they're communicating with real people with real feelings. And this includes bloggers within our own community. We would never have reached the Belfast Agreement or the marriage equality referendum if we had announced that we hate and despise Christians, if we made outrageous allegations against people, or if we had called people fuckheads and wankers and lunatics. We wouldn't tolerate behaviour like that from our children, and we shouldn't tolerate it from our adult colleagues. When we get into dialogue, we should start with human rights. And Atheist Ireland, in fact, bases all of our policies on a foundation of international human rights. We believe it's the closest that you can get to an objective foundation upon which to build other policies about what is desirable. Because human rights are not lofty aspirations. They're the rock-bottom minimum standards that we should expect to be starting from without having to campaign on. Human rights standards are difficult for our opponents to argue against because they're not merely our personal preferences. And if we find ourselves disagreeing with some of the international human rights standards, we should ask ourselves, is it possible that we are mistaken and that the human rights standards might be better than what we think is best? In 2 weeks' time, Atheist Ireland will travel to Geneva, where the United Nations will be examining the Irish state about its human rights obligations under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And we'll be briefing the committee before it questions the Irish state, and we'll also be giving the committee real-time analysis during the questioning of the Irish state. And we'll be able to correct in real time incorrect answers that Ireland is giving to the United Nations. It's the second year that we'll have done this, following our successful interventions in Geneva last year, when Ireland was being questioned by the UN Human Rights Committee under a different treaty, which was the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And at that time, the UN Committee told Ireland that it was breaching fundamental human rights of atheists, and indeed of minority faiths, including freedom of conscience, equality before the law, freedom from discrimination, very fundamental rights, as raised by Atheist Ireland in our submissions to the committee. And as with many of our campaigns, we'll be travelling with allies from other human rights advocacy groups in Ireland, including campaigners against poverty, campaigners against discrimination against other minority groups, and campaigners for abortion rights in Ireland, of which Atheist Ireland is one and is quite prominent. Now, last year, as well as getting many important decisions in our favour with regards to secular issues, including religious discrimination in schools and hospitals, including religious oaths for high office and including the blasphemy law in Ireland, the UN Human Rights Committee also made a significant point to Ireland that applies just as much to other countries. During that session, Ireland told the UN committee that the reason that it denies pregnant women in Ireland the abortion rights that they are due under the Covenant was because the government was expressing the will of the Irish people as expressed in referendums. There's another clause in the Covenant that says that the people have the right to express their will. And the UN Human Rights Committee told Ireland that this was a completely unacceptable reason to deny women their right to an abortion. It said that human rights cannot be denied by majority votes in Parliament or referendum, because the whole point of human rights law is to protect individuals from the tyranny of the majority. As well as attending the United Nations, we also attend meetings of the European Union, the Council of Europe, the Organisations for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and other places where we advocate for secularism, often in the face of many much better resourced religious organisations. And I'm delighted to have had discussed at this conference with several people plans to form new secular alliances for these meetings at international human rights regulatory and oversight body meetings, including with Nada from Croatia, Corina from Germany, Morgan Elizabeth from Turkey, Marianne from Britain, and Dan and Annie Laurie from America. I think there's a lot that we can do together if we bring the same level of cooperation as the religious groups do to these meetings. The fourth lesson that I've learned from these various campaigns is the importance of being proactive in politics. I don't for a moment believe that we as peace campaigners were responsible for bringing about the Belfast Agreement ourselves. I don't for a moment believe that we as secular campaigners are responsible directly for the marriage equality referendum. In both cases, I believe that what we were doing was reflecting a public mood that was bubbling away under the surface for years, and that it eventually found expression when accidents of history enabled it to do so. Because I think that that is how political change happens. We live in a world where, from the collapse of the Berlin Wall to the fall of apartheid in South Africa to yesterday's referendum result in Ireland, where momentous changes can happen very quickly that would have seemed unthinkable just a short time before they happen. And we don't know when those changes will happen, and we don't know what will trigger those changes. But we do know that when they do happen, that all of the work that we have been doing will retrospectively become useful, because we will have put in place the foundations that can be used to institutionalise the new changes that are happening, whatever caused them to happen. Politically in Atheist Ireland, we've made it a priority since we were founded in 2008 to normalise the use of the words atheist and secular in political discourse and public discourse. And we're happy that that is now happening. It's no longer unusual for the Irish media to interview a spokesperson for an atheist advocacy group when something happens. That would have been a big shock to people a short time ago. It's now normal. Politicians now expect to be briefed and lobbied on the secular aspects of laws that they're discussing. Again, that wasn't happening before Atheist Ireland started doing this. When laws are being debated, we will provide detailed briefing documents to all parliamentarians on the secular ramifications of what they're proposing. And we're also being proactive. Ireland will soon have a general election. And we're currently in a range of meetings with the people within each party that are responsible for preparing the election manifestos for each party, so that we can try to get secular issues into the manifestos before they're written, rather than having to complain that they're not there after they're written. And we also try to bring international pressure to bear and to support campaigns in other countries through our involvement with Atheist Alliance International and through our involvement in the new international campaign against blasphemy laws. Finally, in February of this year, we had a breakthrough meeting with the Irish Prime Minister, Enda Kenny, and with the Minister for Education, Jan O'Sullivan. It was the first ever formal meeting in Ireland between an atheist advocacy group and the Prime Minister of Ireland. And the meeting was supposed to last an hour. It lasted 2.5 hours, more than twice its scheduled time. And we used that time to explain a lot of things that he wasn't aware of in terms of the fundamental nature of the discrimination against atheists, which is often invisible to people who aren't actively involved in it. That meeting marks the start of an ongoing dialogue process in which we'll be having more detailed meetings with senior civil servant officials in the various departments and with ministerial advisors about the specific changes that are needed in order to protect our fundamental rights. And I've been heartened by the amount of new activists that have emerged during the referendum campaign, and I hope that a lot of those people will continue to be involved on an ongoing basis in political activism for secularism. The final issue, or the final lesson that I've learned from both of those campaigns, is the need for secular schools. Because when Catholics and Protestants grow up never meeting each other until they're adults, it's easier for sectarianism to flourish. And when the Catholic Church controls 90% of Ireland's primary schools and the Protestant churches control most of the rest, it's easy for the rights of atheists to be ignored. And when Atheist Ireland met the Irish Prime Minister and the Minister for Education, we brought with us an atheist parent and an atheist teacher and an atheist pupil to explain firsthand the discrimination that they face in Irish schools. The parent told of his problems getting his child into the local school, where the principal told him that your child is a category 2 boy, which is not a Catholic, and that they might have a place for him after they check if there are places left after all the category 1 boys who are Catholic have applied. That's the level of discrimination that we have to face in Irish schools. We heard yesterday about Toledo during the talk on Islam and Christianity in Europe. But another thing that Toledo is now known for is the Toledo Guiding Principles on Teaching about Religion and Beliefs in Public Schools, which was put together in 2007 by the OSCE, prepared by an advisory council of experts on freedom of religion and belief. And those principles focus on the educational approach to promote teaching about different religions of belief in an objective and critical and pluralistic way, as opposed to teaching religion and religious instruction in a specific religion or belief. And the only OSCE state that has rejected the Toledo Guiding Principles is, unsurprisingly, the Holy See. Now, we don't want to opt our children out of religious education, which is pretty much the only option that we have at the moment. We want to opt our children into an education that is objective, critical and pluralistic. We've had enough of a primary school curriculum that tries to promote the moral and spiritual development of our children through religious education, because that breaches our constitutional and our human rights. If the state curriculum was promoting the moral and spiritual development of religious children through atheist education, we'd never hear the end of it, and everyone would immediately recognise that that was breaching the rights of religious families. So they're the 5 lessons that I've learned. I don't know if I've left time for questions. So they're the 5 things that lessons that I've learned, and I hope that they're both relevant to the conference and also relevant to, that are also broad enough to be applicable to different situations in different countries. Again, to recap, they're stand up to violence, seek respectful dialogue, start with human rights, be proactive in politics, and establish secular schools. And I'm optimistic, I'm certainly more optimistic about doing this in Ireland, in the Ireland that I'll be returning to tomorrow, than I was in the Ireland that I left on Friday to come here. Thank you very much. This is us attending the OSCE, which is the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. They have a human rights implementation meeting every year in Warsaw. We've attended it for the last 4 years, and we hope that we'll get more atheist groups coming with us to this in future years, because there are quite a lot of religious advocacy groups there. This is one of our many Atheist Ireland information tables. We do this once a month in various places around the country, so that will be several times a month around the country, where we don't approach people to give them information, but we just have a table with information. If people approach us, we'll explain to them what it is that we're about, what atheism is and what secularism is. This is us meeting a group of students that were coming over from Denmark. And we do this regularly in terms of both meeting youth groups and meeting groups coming from abroad to just talk about the differences between various countries and places with regard to secularism. This is our meeting with the Taoiseach, Enda Kenny, and the Minister for Education, John O'Sullivan. And what's significant about this meeting, this picture, by the way, this is quite a significant picture for what isn't in it. You'll recall that I said that we had a teacher and a pupil at the meeting as well. They had to stand out of that picture because they were afraid, legitimately, that if they were seen to have been complaining about the discrimination that they faced, even to the Taoiseach, which is our Prime Minister, that they could face further discrimination in their schools. And the Prime Minister couldn't even say to them, well, we'll stop that from happening because they're legally allowed to discriminate. So what is a day that should have been a proud moment, certainly for a pupil in a democracy, however cynical you are about politics, it should be a proud day for a school child to be meeting the Prime Minister of a country. In Ireland, when they meet the Prime Minister of the country in these circumstances, they have to stand out in the photograph. This was our international conference on empowering women through secularism 2 years ago, which was a great success, and from which we have a series of policies on empowering women that we use as part of our lobbying documents both in Ireland and internationally. That's just our logo. That's actually our press conference recently about the referendum. That was the World Atheist Convention that we hosted in Dublin in 2011, which was the convention at which the newly restructured Atheist Alliance International was relaunched. And this is yesterday here, when some of the people here were hearing the results from the Irish referendum. That's it. Thank you very much.